Today's sermon is titled Crying Uncle: What Pandemic-Era Childcare Taught Me About Human Rights Advocacy, to be delivered by Josh Leach. Josh is the Public Policy and Communications Strategist at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, where he has worked in a variety of policy and advocacy roles, focusing primarily on the organization's Migrant Justice Program. Prior to that, Josh was a student minister at the First Parish in Bedford, Massachusetts. He is a graduate of Harvard Divinity School and a perpetual candidate for the UU ministry. We're very pleased to have Josh with us today. Josh, take it away.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you all for being here and welcoming me into this very warm and loving community. Delighted to have the opportunity to share about the work of Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, a human rights organization that, as you know, is inspired by and dedicated to advancing UU principles of justice, equity, and compassion in human relations around the world. I'll be sharing with you more about our recent work later on in this talk, but I wanted to start with a personal story because I believe it's affected how I approach my job at UUSC and the work that we do together. Now, in order to tell this story, I have to start by saying that for my whole life, I've never known if I was what people call good with kids. There never really was an opportunity to put this to the test. I was the youngest sibling in my family growing up, the youngest cousin in our extended family. Most days I feel I'm the youngest everything, and still surprises me that the older I get, the more people there are who are younger than me. I had nothing against kids, but I didn't see myself becoming a parent or spending much of my adult life in their company. It was a source of some anxiety to me, therefore, when I found out that I was going to become an uncle. Excitement too, for sure, when I learned my nephew was on the way, but tinged with anxiety. What if he hates me, I thought? What will he and I have to talk about? And I remembered that for a good long period, he wouldn't be talking at all, and I was even more at a loss. I had my fair share of parlor tricks that I thought or hoped might entertain a small child. I could and can still recite every line from memory of the original Star Wars trilogy in all the voices. I can gargle Christmas carols. I can even pen a Jabberwocky-esque epic of nonsense verse called Bibulus and Scribulus and the Odoriferous Slosh. But going too far down this path posed a risk even greater than that of simply not being good with kids. The opposite peril of trying too hard. A line in the book instead of a letter, a moving personal memoir about childlessness by the British writer and editor Diana Athill stopped me cold when I read it. Speaking of her emotionally distant father, she observes, quote, "We thought him clever when he made up nonsense verses for us." Oh God, that's me, I thought. But that was as far as their relationship ever went. She contrasts his stiffness and forced jocularity with the natural ease she observed in other fathers. Quote, "I sometimes watch my brother handling 3 small sons," she writes, "and I see exactly what it is that my father could not feel. My brother will throw his boys about, stand by a window to watch them play in the garden with an unconscious smile of pure pleasure on his face. He loves them with a comfortable animal warmth, and they respond to it like crocuses in the sun." I very much wanted to be like that brother, but I dreaded I would prove to be more like Attill's father when the time came to put it to the test. And that time arrived in a bigger way than I could have anticipated. In March 2020, all of our lives were upended. My sister was already several months pregnant when the global pandemic seemed to throw our world into turmoil. She and her husband were living about an hour's drive away in Rhode Island. I was in Massachusetts, but on March 12th, our office at UUSC, like so many others, decided to go remote. I didn't much fancy living alone and indoors for the next indefinite number of months. In those early days of the pandemic, we had no idea how long this all might last or how completely our society might change or unravel. My sister called me. "Just bring whatever soap or hand sanitizer you have in the house and get down here," she said. I packed my life into a suitcase and headed to Providence, convinced that Massachusetts state troopers were about to seal off the highways behind me at any moment. For the next 3 months, and intermittently since, we barricaded ourselves inside, forming a 3.5-person quarantine bubble. My sister spent the final trimester of her pregnancy under coronavirus lockdown, and my nephew came into being in a world that had changed perhaps permanently from what we'd known before. Our 3.5-person bubble became 4, and I got much more of a crash course in pandemic era uncling than I'd bargained for. Being with my nephew 24/7 over the many months after he was born, I quickly learned a few things about childcare. The first is that if you thought you had to be entertaining, you soon realize that more baseline goals are in order. All the nonsense verse in the world I discovered barely got me through one 15-minute interval between naps. The pressing need was not to be fun per se, because food, sleep, and shelter were more urgent considerations. It would be many months still before my nephew climbed high enough in Maslow's hierarchy of needs to expect novelty. And once he reached this stage, most of what he wanted to do every day was just to practice climbing up and down stairs over and over again. I didn't really have to come up with anything to do or say. He just wanted to show me he could do it. That's what I realized. It wasn't on me to set the program of entertainment. That was out of my hands. The kid basically told us what he wanted to do, and we did it. I'm still hopeful that at some point when he's older, my nephew will clamor for more of my Yoda or Chewbacca impression. But the only impersonation skill that really seemed to be called upon in the first year of his life was how to imitate a human version of the snoo, the electric-powered rocking machine that gushed and warbled and shook my nephew to sleep each night. There was one memorable occasion that comes to mind a few months after he was born. I was in the upstairs guest room getting ready for bed when I heard the most blood-curdling scream to have ever pierced my ears. With a newborn in the house, I feared the worst. My head was suddenly full of horrible possibilities. I got my sister on the phone from the floor beneath me, and she explained that she had just seen a bat swooping around the eaves of their bedroom. Now, this perhaps should not have come as a complete surprise. My brother-in-law had mentioned in passing a few weeks before that he thought he had seen a dark shape swooping in the hallway one night. But I hoped that this was the sort of portent that, if ignored, would simply go away. But no, there was no denying it now. There was a bat inside, and this amounted, by order of the state health authorities, to a close contact, which meant that we all had to go to the hospital to get a rabies vaccine. My nephew, understandably, was not pleased with anything about this situation. As we were waiting for our appointment in the lobby of the Rhode Island Children's Hospital, it took all our combined powers of shushing and swaying and bobbing to try to get him back to sleep. At some point, I found myself in full mask and gloves with my infant nephew in my arms, making verbal washing machine sounds and doing ballet-like pliés in the middle of the hospital waiting room, in what I hoped would approximate the experience of being encased in the snoo. If my fear after reading Athill's description of her father, that is to say, was that in the presence of small children, I'd be over-rehearsed and self-conscious, that concern, at least, was by this point disproved. If there's one thing childcare did for me very quickly, it was to eliminate any lingering trace of shame. Most of all, I think what I realized is that the whole question of bonding, that comfortable animal warmth that Diana Athill was talking about, isn't something that needs to be analyzed or willed into being. It just sort of happened. Kids tend to bond with or attach, in the psychological lingo, any adult caregivers in the simple course of things. And the process was quickly taken out of my conscious control. An example, I'm sitting on the sofa trying to answer a single work email on my phone. My nephew comes over and grabs me round both knees. "Just a moment," I say. He nudges the phone away. I frown and he smiles up at me. A transformation is effected in that moment. The email can wait. He implants the thought in my brain. He needs something from me. Maybe it's just food. Maybe he wants to eat my iPhone. Maybe he wants to eat me. But whatever the case, he has a survival need, and he sees me as the one in this moment who can remedy it. There's a biological compulsion that kicks into my brain that's simply inarguable. Must feed baby, I think. Must make sure he is okay. After months of living this way, I started to notice that I experienced the world differently. Stories in the news or at work where something bad had happened to a family or a small child gripped me in a new way. They upset me at a deeper level. I talked to my sister about this. Oh, she said, so your brain has been broken too. The warpage of my mental state only became more manifest in the months ahead. In all my years on this earth, I'd never noticed other people's kids, for instance. But here one day, I'm leaving my apartment to hop in the car, and I see my neighbor playing in the street with his infant son, who is wheeling himself about in a plastic carrier. My head is suddenly scanning the environment for every possible hazard that could threaten the life of a toddler. It was like a knife into my heart. I realized then that my nephew, however, unwittingly has placed great chains upon my life. I'm no longer free. I'll never be able to get through the world without feeling responsible for the well-being of random children that I encounter. I tell you all of this not just because it changed something in me, but because more specifically, it changed how I feel about my work at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. This work for human rights had become personal in a way it wasn't quite before. Now, I had been working on immigration advocacy for UUSC throughout all 4 years of the Trump administration, including during the implementation of his notorious family separation policy. We had partners working at the border who saw the effects of this policy directly, children's being taken from their parents' arms, with their only adult caregivers being deported across multiple borders. Many of these families have still not been reunited 3 years later due to various bureaucratic delays and backlogs. Some of the children have been apart from their parents for so long by now that they've lost the ability to speak in their native language. I knew enough at the time all this was happening to grasp intellectually the horror of it, the violation it constituted the most basic rights. But I didn't realize until my nephew was born and came into the world quite the immensity of it. I didn't realize what 3 years of enforced separation between a small child and an adult caregiver could mean, how critical those early years are, how fundamental the bonds formed during that time are, and what an inconceivable act of violence it takes to rip them asunder. Nor is family separation just a matter for historical reckoning, some wrong from the recent past for which our government must atone. I wish I could say it was, but I can't. The Biden administration, despite their plans to restore dignity and humanity to US border policies, continues to inflict practices that separate children from their loved ones. They may not be tearing kids from mothers and fathers' arms the way Trump's policy was, but they are tearing them from the arms of aunts and uncles, which is hardly much better. And so UUSC's and our partners' advocacy continues. The way in which these extended family units are often separated at the border is not very well known. It's not as notorious as Trump's family separation policy, but it is real and happening every day. Under a policy that long predates Trump and that has continued after him, the US government, as standard practice, separates children from any adult they're traveling with who can't establish legal guardianship. This often includes grandparents, older siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles. The children are then legally categorized and processed as unaccompanied minors, meaning that they're housed by a different agency than the enforcement agencies that process and in many cases deport solo adults. Now, this separation is no doubt traumatic for many children who cross the border alongside a trusted adult relative. The government argues, however, it's necessary to screen against the risk of human trafficking. And in the past, at least, they could say in defense of their actions that the separation was in most cases temporary. Under the old rules, the older adult relatives who crossed the border alongside the children could eventually hope to be reunited with them once they were released from detention and had a chance to pursue their own asylum case in immigration court. After that point, they could serve as sponsors for the unaccompanied children, thereby permitting the family to reunite. But a policy at the border known as Title 42 changed all of that. Starting in March 2020, the Trump administration began enforcing a new system, which they invented, although they cloaked it in a decades-old public health law that had never previously been used in this way to deny asylum. According to this new policy, anyone who is caught crossing the border, regardless of their need for humanitarian protections and the risks they faced back home, could be summarily expelled from the country without a chance to seek asylum. This meant no interview to establish credible fear, no chance to press one's claim for protection before an immigration judge. Unaccompanied children, meanwhile, have been exempt from this policy under the Biden administration, which is plainly the right call. But to this president's disgrace, he has continued to enforce the larger Title 42 expulsion order against adults. The result of these policies combined is that once extended families are separated at the border, as we described, the children, as we mentioned, are labeled as unaccompanied and processed as such, even if they came with adult caregivers. They're transferred away from an aunt or uncle that they may have traveled with, and who may be the only trusted adult they know in the country. Then that aunt or uncle or other adult relative is expelled from the border permanently with no chance to seek asylum. USC heard from our partners at the border about this policy before it was widely discussed anywhere else. Many of my waking and working hours since then have been devoted to trying to bring the full scale of the effects of this Title 42 policy to wider notice. For as I've tried to explain, this is more than just a professional issue for me now. The separation of the separation of aunts and uncles from their nieces and nephews under Title 42 has attained a special poignancy for me. As an uncle who has been at times a major caregiver in his nephew's life, I know that these bonds are profound, and that a separation between any caregiver and child, whether they're formally legal guardians or not, is an unspeakable trauma, particularly when it involves a potentially permanent expulsion and separation across closed borders. The reporter Adolfo Flores recounts the story of one such separation that happened in May of this year under the current Biden administration as a result of Title 42. Quote, immediately after landing on the banks of the Rio Grande in Roma, Texas, Herbert promised his crying 4-year-old nephew that he would never leave him. But days later, inside a Border Patrol facility, he was forced to break that vow. I have nothing against you, Herbert said, a young Border Patrol agent told him, but the child is going to a shelter and you're going back to Mexico. Herbert explained, I couldn't take him with me because I'm just his uncle, but I also don't know that we will ever recover from that experience. I can't help but see myself in Herbert and my nephew in his own. And it helps me understand at a new level that my rights are his rights, their safety and well-being and liberation are bound up with my own. That is what the human rights movement is all about. It's building on the threads of commonality and empathy that give us our shared humanity. I'll never forget a story I once heard from the great religious leader and human rights advocate, Sister Simone Campbell. She described a state-level politician she knew who had spent much of his career sponsoring anti-immigrant legislation. These were measures to deny undocumented immigrants' driver's license, to deputize state and local police to conduct federal immigration arrests, transferring people to ICE so they could be ejected from the country. But at a certain stage of his career, this politician underwent a change. He suddenly abandoned his support for those laws, and he stopped using anti-immigrant rhetoric to try to drum up votes. Sister Simone Campbell asked him what had changed. He said, "My son was born. As soon as I held him in my arms, I realized that I would do anything to keep him safe. And so I could no longer blame people who cross the border to do the same for their families." Not every politician who currently wants to expel immigrants or separate families is going to be changed in their heart in this way. But if there's any hope for human rights or for the UU values with which they are entwined, I find it here. Whoever we are, whatever our life experiences may have been, we all know that feeling of having someone who is precious to us, whose happiness is more important to us than our own. When we imagine what we would do for their sake, for the sake of their lives and safety, we can perhaps gain some insight into why people brave unimaginably dangerous journeys across land and sea to apply for asylum in the United States. This shared recognition of humanity must be the starting point for our advocacy. That is what we are trying to do with your help at UUSC. We are working every day to revoke the Title 42 policy, restore families' ability to seek asylum together, the US border. Among peer human rights organizations, we were some of the first and most vocal to call attention to this policy's harmful effects. We've authored and placed op-eds in national media outlets trying to make our national leaders aware of the indirect family separation and trauma that their decisions are causing. As grant makers, we've continued to fund and support grassroots organizations working on the front lines of the immigrant rights struggle for better and more just policies. And as advocates, we are mobilizing our members around the nation to call for an end to Title 42, along with family separation and other dehumanizing policies. Just this past week, in fact, we and our colleagues in the Welcome with Dignity Coalition delivered no fewer than 200,000 individual signatures on petitions to the White House, calling on President Biden to finally keep his promises and end the inhumane, unnecessary, and unjust Title 42 restrictions. I urge you today to help us take action. Help us call on the Biden administration. Help us support our grassroots partners throughout the entire region in which migration occurs, from Central America to Haiti to Mexico to the United States. Help us support our partners in Guatemala, for instance, Asociación Pop No, who were among the first to warn us about the impacts of family separation all the way back in the spring of 2018, when they wrote to UUSC with horrified personal accounts of parents who had turned up deported and in tears at the Guatemala City airport after their children had been torn from their arms. Help us support our partners at the UndocuBlack Network, who have investigated and reported in unprecedented detail about the firsthand effects of the Title 42 policy in Haiti, where they have spoken firsthand to families and individuals expelled from the country under this policy with no chance to seek asylum, and who remain in desperate peril in Haiti as a result. When you take home your guest at your table box this year, I ask you to give generously to UUSC, as you have so often in the past, to support this work. My colleagues informed me before joining you today that no fewer than 18 members of this community are already supporters and members of UUSC. This community has also consistently come through for us to support our ongoing operations and partner support, as well as to respond to our emergency appeals in times of particularly grave human rights crises around the world. I know that everyone on our team, including myself, is deeply grateful, and I invite you to revitalize that commitment to UUSC today, whether that comes in the form of becoming a UUSC member for the first time, renewing an existing membership, or making an additional contribution through Guests at Your Table. If there is a child who matters in your life, perhaps you could give with their name in mind. If there's a nephew or niece or child or grandchild, whether grown or still young. I invite you to think of them when you give, and about other children all over the world who have not been able to grow up with the adults they love because of violations of human rights, the unjust actions of governments and militaries. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares in unequivocal terms, every person, quote, of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion, has the right to found a family. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society, and it is entitled to protection by society and the state. When we take action together against family separation, that's the principle we're seeking to uphold. And as we do so, I urge us to remember as well the words of Stephen Spender, which we read earlier in this service. No cause is just. No cause is just unless it guards the innocent as sacred trust. No truth but that which reckons this child's tears and argument. May it be so.